And I taught English and drama in secondary schools in the UK for about 19 years. And alongside the kind of the day job, I got quite involved in what we call over here in the UK, the grassroots movement. So we have quite a lot of education networks that are led by teachers for teachers. So I was one of the co-founders of a network called Women Ed, and Women Ed is a network for women leaders to support women in progressing in their careers. And that's kind of how I ended up doing this work, because through my work with Women Ed, I then supported the launch of some other affinity groups. And as a head teacher, I recruited a team who cared a lot about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we made that a core purpose in our school in Oxfordshire. Since leaving headship, I now support schools on their journey for diversity, equity, and inclusion. So tonight, really, it's an introduction to what that means to us over here in the UK, thinking about some of the key ideas, some of the key concepts, some of the things to kind of think about. And I'm really interested to hear from the international educators on the call about what diversity, equity, inclusion means for you in your contexts, and what perhaps resonates with the things we are focusing on here. So if you are on social media, please do feel free to connect with me on Twitter. I run the Twitter handle DiverseEd2020. And I'm going to talk you through some of the free resources on our website that is growing day by day with free resources for schools who are committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So as a former English teacher, I think it's important to start with the language and to start with the acronyms, because diversity, equity, and inclusion has a lot of buzzwords and has lots of acronyms, like words reduced down to letters. And I want to just break down for you what some of these key words mean to me, to help you and your teams in framing and articulating your commitments. So D standing for diversity, take a moment to think about, what does the word diversity mean to you? If you were going to define that word diversity to a colleague or to a pupil, a student, what does diversity actually mean to you? I think it means different things to different people. So for me, this picture kind of captures diversity. I think diversity is about how we recognise and celebrate difference, and how we see the benefit of difference, and how we are intentional in representing difference and thinking about who is in the room and whose voices are being heard, who is being valued. So that for me is the diversity, the kind of the mixture of people who are in the space. Whereas equity, so in DEI, the E stands for equity. When you see the acronym EDI, it stands for equality. And I want us to think about the difference between these two words, because for a lot of people, they use them as synonyms, they interchange them like they mean the same thing. And equity and equality have slightly different meanings, and I want us to think about which ones resonate with us more. So the infographic on the left, you've probably seen before. It gets shared quite a lot on social media, where equality is, if we were going to give access to those three people to access that sport, to watch that sports game, equality is giving them all the same size box. But giving them all the same size box doesn't mean that they can all access that activity. It doesn't recognise the fact that they've got different starting points and different needs. Whereas equity on the right-hand side of that first image is acknowledging the fact that for the taller person, they don't need any boxes, but for the shorter person, they need 2 boxes. So equity is about that identification and removal of the barriers to create access for those individuals or for that group of people. The picture on the right is one that I use as a different way of looking at it. If we, as a family, so imagine you and your family are going to go on a bike ride, and in your family, you have people of different sizes, different fitnesses, different ages, and different abilities. You wouldn't give them all the same size bike to cycle on. You'd think about the moderation, the kind of modifications that each person needs. The smaller person, the older person, the taller person, the person who's perhaps limb different would need a different vehicle to access that sport. So that for me is equity. And I think for me in education, equity is something we think about a lot when it comes to our pupils and our students, but we need to think about equity for our colleagues and for our staff and the barriers we need to identify and remove for them as well. So that's the D and the E. And then the third letter, when we're talking about DEI, is the I for inclusion, which means something slightly different when we're not in education. So inclusion in education speak, in school speak, is quite often associated with children with special educational needs. The inclusion team is quite often the SENCO, the special needs coordinator, the teaching assistants, and it's specifically looking at supporting a particular group of children. But inclusion in a more global sense, in a more holistic sense, is more about the culture of an organisation, more about the kind of the behaviours, the language, the norms that are how that team coexist, co-create, cooperate with one another. So diversity, equity, inclusion need to be thought of as that triad, as that triangle of how these ideas feed into and out of each other. So just to recap for those three words there, diversity in that first picture is thinking about the difference in the space, thinking about that representation. Equity is thinking about the starting point and the opportunities people have to progress, whereas inclusion is thinking about that holding space and how we need to collapse the hierarchy, or we need to be aware of who has power within that space. So they're the first three kind of key words, but depending on where you are in the world, you might often see the letter J appear. So DEIJ stands for diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. Justice being social justice and what is going on in society and what is going on in the world. So if we think about what's happened in the last 18 months, if we go back to summer 2020 and the very public murder of George Floyd, and then the kind of the BLM, the Black Lives Matters activism that's been global ever since, that is the social justice part of this work. It's the bit where it's bigger than just us as individuals, it's bigger than just a school, it's about social change, and it's about us challenging some of those systems in wider society and addressing and removing those things, the inequities, the barriers that are perhaps prohibiting inclusion for different groups of people to get that access and to be included. And there's one more word I'm going to add in, and that is the B for belonging. So since leaving teaching and headship and working independently, I do a lot of networking on LinkedIn. And I think it's really interesting to look at what is happening in diversity, equity, and inclusion in other sectors. So some of the other sectors are much further forward than us in education. Some of the corporate spaces have been doing diversity work for a very long time, for example, like finance, for example. And a trend I have seen in the last year, 12 to 18 months, is that people who are responsible for EDI, DEI, have got a job title change and rename, and their new job title is Head of Belonging. And people have now got responsibilities and remits in big corporations where they are in charge of belonging. And I think the word belonging, or the concept of belonging, is something that all of us as educators, it really resonates with us. And it's very much part of the work we all do as classroom teachers, as school leaders, as governors. We want to create that sense of belonging for all of the people within our respective school contexts. So I want you to think about how, just by reframing some of this work as this is about belonging, might activate different members of your wider stakeholder group. And this Venn diagram I stole from the head of EDI at Adidas, the sports brand, And Chris Burnett leads all the EDI work across Adidas, and she shared it on LinkedIn and did a blog about it. And I just thought visually it was a really simple way of us thinking about the intersect between diversity, equity, and inclusion, but belonging being at the centre, at the heart of this work. So they're the 5 kind of key terms. And my question to all of you would be to think about what acronyms and language are you using about this work? And how can you create that shared understanding, that shared language in your respective schools and organisations so that we're using consistent language? I don't mind whether you talk about D&I or EDI or DEI, but choose which one you're going to use and be consistent so people are using the same language and understand which acronym is being used and why. So I wanted just to move on to a campaign in the UK that is on social media so that those of you who are international can also follow this. So there's a charity in the UK called No Outsiders. And the No Outsiders campaign came from an assistant head teacher called Andy Moffat and the school he works at in the West Midlands. And they were doing some really progressive work a few years back around creating belonging in the early years and primary school setting for young children. And it caused a bit of a social fallout. And basically some of the local wider community, there's a big Muslim faith community in this part of the Midlands, didn't like the fact that this school was talking about some of the protected identities and characteristics such as sexual orientation in a primary setting. And it caused quite a big social sort of like dialogue about what was age appropriate. And what came out of this this period of protest, should we call it, was a campaign called No Outsiders, where schools can sign up to become a No Outsiders school. And all that means is that you are signing up to receive a weekly newsletter where Andy shares headlines and images from around the world of stories that you can use in your assemblies, in your tutor activities, in your carpet discussions with your children in your school, to talk about this idea of what does it mean to not have outsiders? What does it mean to belong? And they also have things like you can purchase, such as a plaque to put in your school reception. So I just think that's a really simple way to connect with other schools who are doing this work as well. And that leads on to us, diverse educators, and how we frame our work. So this is our hero image. And this is kind of the image that we use for our branding. And it's very deliberate in the 9 squares on the floor, because in a second, we're going to talk about the law. And in the UK law, we have 9 identities that are protected in law, protected from prejudice, exclusion, marginalisation, discrimination, etc. So this floor is the 9 identities co-created, coexisting, and everyone's got access to this space. And our mantra, be where you are celebrated and not tolerated, is deliberately speaking to what in the UK we call the fundamental British values. So in the UK, legally, every school, to be compliant to our inspectorate Ofsted, has to demonstrate how we teach the fundamental British values. And the 5th of the 5 British values is the value of tolerance. And we legally have to demonstrate how we teach our children to be tolerant. And I personally have a bit of an issue with teaching people to tolerate each other. I don't think anyone should be tolerating another human being. I would like us to think about how we can teach beyond the compliance of tolerance and think about acceptance, respect, celebration, love, valuing each other for what we bring individually rather than just tolerating. I think it leaves a bit of a bad taste in my mouth that we're teaching people to tolerate each other. So I'm going to start with the law, and I'm really mindful of the fact that we've got an international audience here. So I'll be interested to hear how this might be similar or different to the legal framework in your own respective countries. So in the UK, the main piece of legislation that we need to be aware of when we're doing this work, DEI work in schools, is the Equality Act that was published in 2010. And the Equality Act consolidated a number of other pieces of legislation until that point and they were all collapsed into this one piece of policy. And this one piece of policy is the kind of the legal protection for us as employers, us as organisations, and it guides us around the work we do when we're thinking about diversity, equity and inclusion. So in the Equality Act of 2010, it outlines 9 identities, and we call them in the UK protected characteristics, 9 identities that are protected in law so that those individuals, those groups cannot be excluded or marginalised or discriminated against. And these 9 images here, these 9 icons, are our logos for those 9 identities. So my challenge to you all, everyone who's on the call, is between us using the chat, how many of the 9 identities of the 9 protected characteristics can we name without Googling them? I'm just going to see what we can mine from the room. So fire away in the chat and see whether my abstract icons here are helpful or not in making you think about some of the different identities. You put them into the chat, I'm going to count them off, and our challenge is to try and get 7. Most groups try and get 7. Fantastic, Claire. Age, race. 2 already, well done. Sexuality, it's 3. Disability, 4. Quick fire here, team, well done. Marriage, maternity. Maternity, pregnancy is 1 together, so we're at 5. So faith and belief, Sarah, well done, that's 6. I think I've missed them out here. We've got gender, that's 7. Very impressed. What's missing? Maybe I've missed one off my counting. Religion, okay. Very impressed. Let me go to the next slide and I'll show them to you. So in the eyes of the British law, the UK law, these are the 9 identities protected from law. And I'm just going to talk you through each of them in relation to what's happening over here in the UK. So age in this context is about ageism as opposed to youth. There's lots of laws that protect children and children's rights. So this is about how we protect people as they mature in society. But if we think about education in particular, in the UK, we have to teach until we're 65 before we can draw our pension. And in the UK, there's quite a lot of ageism about older teachers, and older teachers perhaps being more expensive teachers. And we see adverts in the UK looking for younger, less experienced teachers because they are cheaper per se. So that's the first one, age. Disability is a big one because 22%, 1 in 5 of us have a disability or an additional need in wider society. So 1 in 5 people have a condition or a diagnosis or a need that needs to be met. Disability also includes a mental health diagnosis. So if we think about pre-pandemic in the UK, we had a mental health crisis. During the pandemic, there's been a lot of trauma and a lot of people's mental health has suffered. And then coming out of the pandemic, we're now seeing a number of people, perhaps their trauma is being manifested through mental ill health. So actually the number of people with disabilities potentially is going to go up because mental ill health is on the rise. And in the eyes of the UK law, disability also includes long-term sicknesses and conditions such as cancer. So if somebody's suffering from a long-term illness, that would also register them as being disabled in the eyes of the law. So my provocation around disability for us to think about is that I think as schools, we do disability for the children really well. And I think we need to be better at thinking about our staff's needs and what data we have about our staff and how we can meet our staff's needs as professionals within the kind of the wider education sector. I'm going to do gender and sex together because these are the 2 that are the most complicated and probably the most political as well. So let me start with sex first of all, the green one. It used to be called gender and it's now called sex, and it's a bit problematic it's called sex because people immediately think it means something different to what it means. But in the eyes of the law, for this piece of law, Sex means the gender we are assigned at birth. So when someone has a baby and the midwife or the doctor checks the genitalia and pronounces that it's a boy or a girl based on their anatomy, that would be our sex. But our sex is not binary, because you can also be born what we call in the UK intersex. And intersex is when you're born with genitalia from both genders. So there's been some high profile athletes, for example, during the Olympics, people who were born with genitalia from both the male and the female sex. And then which sport do they compete in? Because they're neither male nor female. The gender reassignment one is the one that speaks to the social construction of gender. So I am born female, I'm in a female body, and my gender is cisgender, CIS gender. That means that I am aligned to the body I'm born in, that I identify as being a woman, and I show up in the world as a woman. So I wear clothes such as female underwear, I wear makeup, I wear shoes and dresses. So I kind of conform to society's expectation or stereotype of a female. So gender identities are complicated, and I'm interested to hear how this translates to different contexts, because there are 57 different identities of how we identify our gender. So at one end, we have cisgender, any of us who are aligned with the bodies we were born into. At the other end of the spectrum, we have transgender. Transgender is when somebody is misaligned with the body they're in and how they identify, and they might seek medical intervention to actually change their gender identity. And then you have a spectrum of different gender identities, and many of them would fall under the umbrella term non-binary, which means that people don't identify as gender being as simple as male or female, and that women show up in a feminine way and men turn up in a masculine way, and it's that kind of like box ticking. So I think in the UK, gender reassignment, gender identities is one of the biggest gaps in knowledge for educators. And we've got more and more children coming into primary schools and secondary schools who identify as being non-binary, who identify as being trans, and we need to think about how well equipped we are as a profession to be supporting and safeguarding those different needs. Marriage and civil partnership, thinking about how we present our union with another human being, thinking about the laws around the world, which countries have legalized same-sex marriage, which faiths endorse same-sex relationships. I think people assume that Europe is much more progressive than it actually is. Ireland only legalised same-sex marriage 2 years ago. Switzerland have not yet legalised it. They voted for it a few weeks ago. So being aware of the fact that there are countries in the global south and the global north who there are different status when it comes to marriage and civil partnership, it's just something to be aware of, and how we celebrate and how we recognise and how we educate and raise awareness about different relationships through our curriculum. Pregnancy and maternity is another big one for education. In the UK, 2/3 of our teaching workforce are female. We're very, very female heavy as a profession. And the biggest demographic of teachers who leave teaching every year are women between the ages of 30 and 39. So our retention and our attrition of women of that demographic is quite significant. And the main reason why women of that age leave is because they have become a mother for the first, second, third time, and their school is not allowing them to work flexibly, or is asking them to return full time, or is asking them to work part-time, but to relinquish their leadership role or their responsibility. So there's lots of work to be done around how family-friendly our profession is. The irony that we serve the families within our community, but sometimes the families of the staff members in the school perhaps are not as high priority. Race, or you might use the term ethnicity for this one, we call it race through the eyes of the law, thinking about racial representation, racial equities, racial inequities, and there's a big movement over here at the moment around anti-racism and thinking about how we can create anti-racist schools and an anti-racist curriculum. We are significantly underrepresented in the UK when it comes to race. So in the wider society, 17% of people don't identify as being white, but only 14% of our teachers aren't white, and only 1% of our head teachers are people of colour in the whole of the UK. Whereas in our primary schools, 24% of our children identify as being black, brown, mixed race. So we are becoming more and more racially diverse as a country, but our workforce does not represent this, and our leadership, head teachers, governance definitely doesn't represent this. So there's a big bit of work going on at the moment about how we can diversify, racially diversify teaching, to think about how we need to recruit teachers who look like the children and make sure we've got leaders who actually represent the communities we serve. Religion and belief, thinking about how we raise awareness of understanding of world beliefs, world faiths, and how we challenge some of the misunderstandings and prejudice when it comes to faiths that perhaps are stereotypes, such as believing in Islam and Islamophobia. This month's Islamophobia month in the UK, and there's lots of raising awareness activities going on to debunk and demystify and destigmatise some of the stereotypes associated with particular religions. In the UK, our school calendar is structured around the Christian festivals, which perhaps historically worked, but we are now a more diverse faiths and religions across society. And sometimes it's problematic when our policies and our school structures don't recognise or don't create space for example, other religions being celebrated. For example, some policies in some schools, staff aren't allowed a day off if they celebrate Eid or if they celebrate other religious festivals such as Diwali. So thinking about how we can be inclusive of and build understanding between different religions and raise awareness is really, really important. I've mentioned sex already, and then the final one, sexual orientation. But the acronym we use in the UK at the moment is LGBTQI+. Again, lots of acronyms. I've got on our website, we've got some different glossaries of the different acronyms. But ultimately, this one is thinking about how visible and how safe are people who identify as being lesbian, gay, bisexual, pansexual, etc., feel in our schools. And we had a piece of law called Section 28 until recently, which prohibited the teaching of identities such as this in our schools. And it's made it quite unsafe for people to share that part of their identity. And we need to think about how are we educating young people about the different sexual expressions, but also how are we protecting the staff within the school system to make sure that they feel safe physically and psychologically within our school context as well. So that's through the eyes of the UK law. They are the 9 identities that are protected. So when we're talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, we are thinking about the holistic exploration and discussion and teaching of these identities, but also the intersectional. So intersectionality is a concept about how we need to recognise the fact for a lot of people, they don't just tick one of these boxes. They don't exist in one compartmentalised identity. They might hold multiple protected characteristics. So a woman of colour who is disabled, for example, would have a very different experience of society in the world to I as a heterosexual, cisgender, white woman. So we need to recognise the intersect, the interplay between these different identities and how people are navigating multiple layers sometimes of disempowerment or disenfranchisement or marginalisation by society and by systems and structures in our workplaces. So I just want to share this diagram here of the iceberg, just to really emphasise the fact that not all of these identities are visible. And sometimes we perhaps focus on the ones we can see or the ones that we can identify with our naked eye. But as you can see, there's more identities below the waterline than there are above the waterline. And a number of these identities are invisible or hidden, or are reliant on someone disclosing quite personal information to other people about their sexual orientation, or about their marital status, or about their gender representation. So it's one of the things we need to think about, because in some schools, I've definitely seen this happen, that schools are perhaps reacting to the ones they can see, or reacting or doing the work on the ones that are visible, and are not paying a similar focus to perhaps the ones that we don't always have the data about. We also need to be really mindful of the fact that just because we can sometimes see someone is visually different, that we don't stereotype or make assumptions about someone and assume that someone holds particular traits, because sometimes we have got an unconscious bias, and perhaps we're misreading a situation or misinterpreting an identity. So that is why we created the website. So the website's only a year and a few months old. And the idea of the website is that it is a signposting website for the school system in the UK and beyond, to find information, to find training, to find resources, to specifically help schools in navigating this DEI, DEIJ, DEIB work, but it's structured around the Equalities Act. So if a school identifies, for example, they want to do some work on anti-racism, or they want to do some work on flexible working, or they want to do some work on the menopause, then they can find specific sections on our website which are going to signpost organisations working in that space, blogs about those topics, toolkits and resources. So you can kind of look at the website through a holistic lens, or you can specifically look at those different identities that perhaps you want to focus on. So my question for you all to think about is, in your respective contexts, we've got a range of people from different schools, UK and international, and people who work in charities and perhaps hold roles such as governance roles. If you were going to be really, really honest with yourself about the school and the community you serve, which of these identities would you say are high profile, i.e. you can see there is a visible commitment to them? People are talking about these identities, there's training, there's visibility and representation around the school, and which ones perhaps are low profile, are not being talked about, are not being addressed, there aren't policies to support, and there's not training in place. And you don't have to share that, that's just a question for me to ask you to think about. Just go back over those 9 identities and just think about, where might the focus and the attention and the resource be? And are there any identities that are perhaps being neglected or not being addressed at the moment? And it might be culturally specific to it being sensitive for the countries some of you are located in as well. I'm just going to follow up by asking you, why might that be? What might be driving a focus on some of these identities as opposed to a lack of focus on some of the others? Is it perhaps because of representation in your student body or staff body? Is it perhaps because you've got a certain makeup in your local community? Is it perhaps because things have been happening locally, regionally, nationally, internationally regarding that protected characteristic? So I want us to think about what's driving that focus, because there will be a perception in all of our schools and various spaces that there is an invisible hierarchy of these identities. And it might not be an intentional hierarchy, but by focusing on some of them, there'll be individuals and groups who perhaps feel neglected, who perhaps feel they're not seen, they're not heard, they're not valued. And I'll give you a tangible example of this. A week after George Floyd's murder, where we had this spotlight on race around the world, 3 trans women were also murdered in the States, but we didn't see the same level of traction, the same level of reporting about those murders. And in the last 18 months in the UK, there's been a lot of trans hate, there's been a lot of transphobia, there's been some celebrities making some really inappropriate comments on social media, and we've got some institutions who are perhaps neglecting to keep safe particular groups in their employee bodies. So we might not be intentionally creating this hierarchy, but there will be a perception from some individuals and subgroups within our communities that they are less important because we are focusing on some of those identities. So my encouragement is for us to think about this intersectionally, holistically. How can we create an inclusive environment with inclusive behaviours and inclusive language and policies and practices that looks after all of these identities, rather than perhaps just spotlighting on some. So I'm not going to ask you to do this activity now, but I just wanted to give you an activity to take away as a kind of a tool, as an activity, a reflective tool, to begin to think about your own relationship to some of this work. And it comes from a book by a former colleague of mine, a really good friend of mine, Benny Carver. So when I was head, Benny was my deputy head, and Benny is a leading light when it comes to diversity in the curriculum. And she wrote a book last November called The Little Guide to Diversity in Schools. And it's really small and it's really practical, and I recommend it as a starting point for upskilling us all, but also to have conversations in our respective school contexts. So in this activity, she does invite you to draw those 4 circles on a page and to begin to capture your own lived experience and your own relationship with those different identities. So I'll model it with me and give you some examples of my own identity, my own journey. So if you start in the core circle, the my identity, reflecting on which of those protected characteristics are part of your own lived experience. So as I've mentioned, if I was going to define myself, I'm a heterosexual white woman, I'm cisgendered, I'm able-bodied, I haven't got children, I'm not married. So I actually have got a lot more privilege than perhaps some of my colleagues have because of those identities I hold. I was also brought up in North Devon, and for those of you from the UK, North Devon is a very white part of the UK. It's in the West Country. So I wasn't exposed to a lot of diversity as a child. I went to a school where all my teachers were white, and most of my fellow students were also white. And it wasn't until I went to university in Canterbury in Kent where my circle began to get more diversified. And when I then started to teach in London, that's when I really became more aware of diversity. So that's my identity, what I hold, what my own experience is directly. The second circle is thinking about what have I learned about other identities through key relationships, through key people in my circle. So thinking about siblings, family members, closest friends, closest colleagues, who perhaps hold a different identity to your own. I'm never going to have lived experience of being gay or being Black, but I've got friends who have educated me about those identities because of the circles I sit in and the conversations I have with them. So I've got a bit more knowledge and understanding of those identities than perhaps I have of some of the others. The third circle is then thinking about who I teach or who I've taught. I've worked in a lot of boys' schools. I've worked in a lot of schools where there's a high proportion of Black and brown boys in particular. I'm quite often the only woman in the room. I'm quite often the only white person in the room. I've worked in schools with a high percentage of children with special needs and a high percentage of children with mental health needs. So that has very much influenced who I am as an educator, thinking about how I create belonging for and representation of those different identities. And then the final circle is perhaps the most interesting one to really reflect on, thinking about, of those 9 protected characteristics, who have I not been exposed to? Who have I not met? Who do I have no understanding or no awareness of when it comes to different religions, when it comes to different sexual orientations, when it comes to different gender identities? So one of my gaps, one of my kind of, we used to call them blind spots, we now call them blank spots because blind spot is an ableist term. So one of my blank spots are the fact that I haven't ever worked alongside a colleague who is non-binary or trans before. However, as a head of a co-ed school, I had a number of non-binary and trans children in my school. That wasn't until my 17th year of teaching. I'd never had any training until that point on how to support non-binary identities. So it was a massive unknown for me. And I had to upskill myself as the head very quickly and upskill my team really quickly to make sure that we were going to support that key group of pupils in our school. So we had training, we did reading, etc. I'm not an expert, I've definitely got a smaller blank spot than I had before. So this activity is a good activity to do individually, but it's then a good one to do with a team, because there will be individual blank spots, but you then get collective blank spots or institutional blank spots where nobody's got any knowledge of some of those identities. And when, for example, a governing body is then ratifying a policy for uniform, but every single person in the governing body is cisgender and straight and white, their lens in signing off that policy is perhaps not as neutral or as holistic as it could be if there were some different identities sat around that table. So I think it's important for us to be able to see that bigger picture of who's not in the room and whose perspective aren't we listening to right now. You will get these slides, so you can steal this one later. This is the other stimulus I wanted to share with you, and we could talk about this one for hours. And I want to give the caveat that this is a very Eurocentric model, because I know we've got international educators here. So when we're talking about diversity, equity and inclusion, what comes up in a lot of conversations is this idea of power and privilege. Who has power, who is empowered, who is disempowered, who has privilege and who doesn't have privilege. And quite often it's talked about in a very binary way, that this group has power and privilege because they're white, because they're male, because they're straight, they thereby have power and privilege. However, this model, the reason why I use it, I think it creates more of the nuances of different ways people have power and privilege in different ways. So if we think of an example, over here in the UK, our Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, he sits in the centre of this wheel in multiple ways. Because he's a white man, because he's got highly educated, because he's heterosexual, because he owns his own house, because he's wealthy, there's multiple ways that whatever meeting Boris Johnson is in, or whatever space he's in, he has power and privilege, and perhaps the power and privilege is invisible to him. If we compare him to a counterpart such as Barack Obama, a man of colour, of a similar kind of status in society, but a man of colour who was called the first Black president of the States. However, he's biracial, he's got dual heritage, he's light-skinned. Some of the Black community in the US actually rejected that he was their first Black head because he's not Black, he's brown. So thinking about racial diversity and lightness and darkness of skin also gives people privilege in different ways in different societies. And then if we compared Barack to his wife, Michelle, a female woman of colour, she would then sit on this wheel in slightly different spaces as well. So the reason why I share this is that it's a good reflection tool, but also a conversation starter to think about ourselves and where we might put ourselves in the different sections of this wheel, and whether or not we would agree or disagree with our own relationship with power and privilege, but also thinking about how our respective society and what it values, how it values, and how different people perhaps get access in different ways. But I'm also interested in hearing from some of the international educators on the call, how this might not reflect your own national context or cultural context, because for some of these, it might be inverted, that actually your society values some of these different identities in different ways. It's also missing religion, which I think is really interesting. So this is a US model, and it's not the UK protected characteristics, but I think it's quite interesting that faith and religion and belief is completely missed. And I'm not sure why that is, but that would be a significant characteristic for many of us to have there as well. I'm going to wrap up in a second so we can do some questions and some thinking. So one of the activities I encourage people to do to disrupt their own understanding and their own identity is to do a diversity walk in their respective school or in their respective workplace, where you step outside of your own body and your own identity, and you change the lens through which you look at your environment, and you consider somebody else's situation. So say, for example, everybody on the call was able-bodied, and we went back to our school and we looked at our school through the lens of someone who is disabled, for a wheelchair user, and we literally go to the school gate, go to the school playground, go through reception, again, this is a UK narrative, go down corridors, go to the dining hall, go to the sports hall, go up to the science lab. Do we have access to all those spaces? Which toilet do we use? Which changing rooms do we use? Do we see ourselves represented in the corridor displays, in the library? So it disrupts the fact that we might have a high sense of belonging and inclusion based on our own identity, but how can we check our own privilege and check our own identity and think about somebody else's lived experience, and would they have a similarly high sense of belonging in that school? And the reason why I use disability as an example is that you might have a cracking display in the PE department or all about the Paralympians, but whose eye level is it at? Is it at the eye level of me, a 6'1" woman walking down the corridor? I can see all those amazing Paralympians. Or is it at the eye level of the person with a disability in the wheelchair wheeling down that corridor? So there might be nods to inclusion that are missed opportunities because the eye level's not the right positioning, perhaps. I'm not going to share this, but I'll send it out in the slide. There's a really nice 3-minute film here about microaggressions that I use when I'm talking about inclusive behaviours. I'm going to finish on this slide and I'm going to come out and take some comments and questions. So a lot of schools start their DEI work thinking about the curriculum, which has its purpose, but I would encourage you to think about the culture of the school before you look at the curriculum, and the cultural commitment of this work on that wider holistic sense before the curriculum starts being looked at. And two of the mantras we use about this work and our approach is, firstly, it's about getting comfortable with being uncomfortable, because talking about diversity, equity, inclusion can become very subjective and very personal. It can become quite painful because we begin to learn things about ourselves and about our employment, about our colleagues, that perhaps has a level of discomfort. We might hear truths about people's lived experience in our school environments that perhaps make us feel a little bit uneasy, but that's where the learning begins. And secondly, we focus on doing the inner work before the outer work. So the activities I've done with you tonight is getting us to think inwardly, introspectively, reflecting on who we are, to understand ourselves before we start understanding others. And I think some people go direct to the doing of, we need to sort this out, we need an anti-racist policy over here, we need to diversify the library over here, but they're not actually doing the looking in the mirror and thinking about their own identities. So I encourage everybody to start with your own learning, your own understanding, and then to do the work as that confidence and as that competence begins to grow. So I'll stop there, Anne. I'm conscious I've done a lot of talking. I want to hear from some people in the room.